Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you join us for another in the trade and related regulatory webinar series for ABMA and AGMA. I'm Nate Bolin, partner here in the Washington, D.C. office of K&L Gates. Have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today. We're going to take time to introduce each of them as they come up in the order. But we're going to cover really most of the main moving parts within Washington, D.C. right now. There's a lot to cover. We'll hit some of the high spots on some of it, but we're going to touch on what's happening with tariffs, with trade, with transportation policy, with tax policy, what's happening within the U.S. Congress. And to kick things off, I'm very pleased to be able to turn it over to my colleague, Congressman Bart Gordon, longtime and well-known representative of the great state of Tennessee. I'll let him speak more to his credentials, and he's going to set the stage for us on all the many things to watch in this area and really kick us off and take it from here. So over to you, Congressman.
Thanks, Nate. As Nate said, my name is Bart Gordon. I served as a member of Congress for 26 years, including being chairman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. I was also a senior member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I joined the law firm K&L Gates in 2011. A quick commercial there. We are a 1 billion plus law firm with offices on 5 continents. We have over 2,000 lawyers, and we got started in 1883. Here in Washington, we are one of the oldest law policy firms, been here for over 50 years, with 135 lawyers and 50 other public policy individuals. And so I've been around for a while, and I can tell you we have the first team for you today as we talk about trade, taxes, reconciliation, and the other things that are going on in Washington now. And believe me, there are a lot of things going on in Washington now. And I would say, as an old timer, my advice is that you can either be at the table or on the menu. And so today we're going to talk about some of those issues, and I would encourage everyone to be engaged. So as I say, we have the A team. We're going to start off today with Finch. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and your background, and then we'll do the same for the others.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bart. I thought you were going to say today's about trade, tax, tariffs, and Trump, and I'm here to talk about Trump, which I'm sure people have already done plenty of talking about in the last month or so. So again, my name's Finch Fulton. I'm a government affairs and policy advisor here at K&L Gates for about the past 2 years. I spent my early career in the House and the Senate, and then served at the U.S. Department of Transportation as a political appointee under President Trump the first time around. And I spent all 4 years there. So I'm very happy to talk with you all today. As I see what the Trump administration's doing in this Trump 2.0 version of itself, I have to sort of think about all of my engagements with a lot of the political appointees that are here today and sort of where that mindset's coming from. Certainly, many of you are aware that President Trump sort of came of age in politics as a Democrat in New York in the 90s. And as we look at sort of the populism bend that he's taken over the years, I think about some of the lessons Stephen Miller gave me. Stephen Miller, of course, is now the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy under President Trump at the White House right now. But we worked together in Senator Jeff Sessions' office. Shockingly, we're the same age. I always thought he was a decade older than me, and he always sort of carried himself as if he was a decade older than me. So when he was sort of telling me through the mindset that he was bringing to Senator Sessions and ultimately bent Senator Sessions into this very populist approach that very much appealed to President Trump and that, led President Trump to bringing Jeff Sessions in as his first attorney general. It's all about the hollowing out of the middle class and, the sins of the 90s, right? Taking these jobs and through NAFTA and through free trade programs and looking for the lowest cost, we hollowed out the jobs and the manufacturing capabilities here in the United States. Now, this is something that has really resonated with people for the last decade plus. They didn't feel like Republicans had their side, and they stopped feeling like Democrats had their side. And this became very apparent in 2016 when President Trump pulled that vote away from Hillary Clinton in shocking numbers at the time and ended up beating her on the backs of blue collar and organized labor votes. And it was because of this message of needing to bring these jobs in American manufacturing back home again so that we have them for our people to work. Whether or not you agree with it, it's a message that resonated. And what we've seen through the first 4 years under President Trump was this focus on America first, sometimes at the expense of international partners, sometimes not. So as we look at what's happened since, so one, we had an election come after and President Joe Biden won. Part of this was in part because of how President Trump took these organized labor voters and brought them into his camp, which was shocking. President Joe Biden had to go in even further and say, I will be the most pro-union president of all time. I will do everything I can to win the unionized vote, to win organized labor, to be in their camp, to fight for them, to be at the picket lines, on and on and on and on. And he did do everything he could within his power to win those votes back. But then he couldn't run for re-election. And what we saw is when Trump ran against Harris, he won those votes, in shocking numbers. And what we've seen is that, the Teamsters found that they were unable to endorse Vice President Harris, despite all of the desires of their leadership. But rank and file members were supporting President Trump 53% to 47%. And in the final vote, I think it ended up being 56% pro-Trump over Vice President Harris in the presidential election. So this whole blue-collar populist push has been decades in the making, but we've seen fundamental shifts in the Republican and Democratic Party. People forget that before President Trump beat the Democrats, he beat the Republicans. And then he kept beating them in the offseason. When the Democrats had the White House, he was still pulling victories away, changing the fundamental nature of the Republican Party. He didn't quit, right? And one of the things that I think has led to the dramatic speed at which we've seen everything playing out in Washington, D.C. Sorry, I'm pointing at the White House right here, which is, right out of view, but a block away, is because we had the first administration in the first 4 years. And then, of course, you can only plan for one session at a time, one administration at a time. But, obviously you make plans for what you're going to do for the next 4 years. Well, we didn't get that next 4 years. And so everybody that went back out into the ether, President Trump announced that he was running again almost immediately. And so the band stayed together. Unlike everybody sort of being dispersed in the ecosystem, everybody that wanted to go back in was already starting to work on this. So I'm one of those people those crazies that worked on Project 2025. But it was very much bringing, here's what we did under the first Trump administration under Secretary Chao. Had we had 4 years, here's what we would have done. And, my stuff was like about automated vehicles and things like that. You had, a couple dozen people that put content in the DOT section, and then hundreds of people that you can see in the book that just submitted information. Everybody was thinking about it and everybody was already putting it in. So I believe I did my work on that back in December of 2023, I believe. And then it was published in May of 2023. December of 2022, May of 2023. So it was already outdated by then, but then work started moving on the America First Policy Institute. And so you had lots of people thinking through what they would recommend for draft executive orders, draft regulations, key policy priorities. Some of it was reactive to what President Biden was doing, because as we were sitting there looking at what was going on, we said, well, I wouldn't have done that, or I would have done it this way, and here's how I changed that. But it was the team in the offseason prepping and planning as if they were going to be going back in. It was a shadow government of sorts, bringing together all these recommendations. So as a side note, I have zero doubt believing that President Trump never read Project 2025. You've ever seen, it's thick, it's dense. I've only read the transportation section, and it's because my name is partially on it. And there's a lot of stuff I didn't see until it was published in there. So everybody sort of has the same mindset. But it's not crazy for any institution to put together a series of recommendations for an incoming administration. The difference is it was written by a lot of people that served the first time around, and we've seen a lot of people get selected the second time around that can go in. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to carry out everything that was in there, because, I got to serve on the 2016 Trump transition team. And then I started day one on the beachhead team on January 20th, 2017. One of the things I experienced is as we were pulling in all those recommendations back then, it very much mattered who was hired for any position. I had one item in particular that I pulled together these recommendations. Won't say what the issue is, but I packaged it, provided it, and then gave it to the nominee at the time, Secretary Chao. We reviewed it and said, "Oh, Finch, who gave you this?" I said, "Oh, I pulled it myself from this think tank. A couple different sources, but here's what I think we should do in this area." She said, "Okay, but nobody nobody at the White House or anybody told you to put this in there, right? I said, no, ma'am. She said, okay, well, I'm not mad, and this is perfectly well written, but I never want to see this again. Okay. I said, oh, okay, yes, ma'am. And so I, deleted all notion of it. But the point in me saying it is the person that the president selects to be in charge of that mode, that agency, that department, you name it, personnel is policy. So they can decide they don't want to do something that was in any of these documents and they just won't do it, right? So what we've seen is President Trump has selected many populists, many people that understands his agenda, that have communicated his agenda, that have experience with it, that have been fighting it with public debates, fighting for it with public debates. And so he's had the first 4 years of people, and he brought in a lot of people that may not have worked with him before the first time around. Then you had the off season where President Biden was in charge, where a lot of people were vying for these positions and fighting it out on behalf of the president's agenda. And then these are the people that have been selected to go in. So loyalist or not, these are people that knew what they were getting in for and have fought the fights publicly and now must implement the programs. That doesn't mean they're going to do everything that was in Project 2025 or the AFPI documents or the like, but it does mean that those are the people and those are the mindsets they're bringing to the game. So they did have 4 years to prepare, and now they're bringing it to bear with all these executive orders and documents and plans that have been brewing for the last 4 years. And again, because it was the team sitting on the bench in the offseason, I think that's fundamentally different than what we've seen from, President Obama's team coming in and then it transferring over to President Biden's team after a 4-year gap. I just think fundamentally it's different because you know who the players are that you worked with last time that are coming in today. So I think that sort of explains the pace of things. That whole populism mindset has become more and more apparent. And, I still think that most people don't understand that if President Trump has to choose between the populist idea and the popular idea with the business community, he's going to choose the populist idea every time. And that's what drove him back in the 90s. That's what drove him to success in the 2010s. And that's what brought him back into the White House today. So that is very much where his head is. And I don't see him relenting anytime soon. That, Nate, I believe I can turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Finch. I think you did an amazing job of explaining a few things that we're experiencing right now in the second administration. And one of them is sort of the key hallmark, and this is true for trade, but it's true for almost everything else, is the speed, the pace of this administration. We have over 75 executive orders in the first 30 days of the administration. That's unprecedented. And those are not just, incidental executive orders. Each one of those is a weighty topic in and of itself. And we've seen a number of them that deal with trade. So you have this team that has come in, they're well prepared, they're ready, and they have a very clear plan about where they want to go to implement the president's agenda. I think most of you know me, but I'm Nate Bullen. Again, I'm a partner here at K&L Gates. I started out my career in the U.S. Commerce Department in the first George W. Bush administration at the International Trade Administration. And then in 2004, was hired out of there by Robert Lighthizer, who was then in private practice, later became the U.S. Trade Representative in President Trump's first term. Also had a chance to work with Jamison Greer, who is now the nominee and to be confirmed today, in fact, by the Senate as the next USTR for President Trump. So we have certainly a very clear path and a clear set of checklists that this administration is following on trade issues. And that is what accounts for the pace that we're seeing. I'm going to try to do two things in the time I have for this presentation, and we'll have additional webinars coming up over the next few months that will unpack some of this in more detail, because there's a lot to talk about here. But what I'm going to try to accomplish is give you a sense of where to turn to understand what the administration not only has done so far on trade, but where it's going next. And then I'm going to try to give you a rack up of where we are with tariffs, because I know for many of you that's probably front of mind. So if you want to understand where this president in his second term is going with tariffs and trade, we have a playbook. It's public. It's out there. It was one of the actions that was taken on his first day in office, and it's called the America First Trade Policy. That lays out approximately 20 separate actions, 20 separate planks or instructions to all the agencies within Washington, within the executive branch that have a stake in tariff and trade policy. That includes USTR. It also includes Commerce Department, Treasury, OMB, other agencies that have an input into that process. And of those 20 planks in that policy, it's notable a few patterns emerge. One, all but 3 of them deal primarily with China. And we've talked in the past on past webinars about how important China is in the U.S. trade relationship globally. This administration recognizes that, and it's focused like a laser on what are the issues the U.S. needs to address with its trade relationship with China. As some of you may have heard earlier today in his first cabinet meeting, President Trump indicated he wants to try to have a positive relationship with China. So I don't think we're necessarily heading for a complete sharp break, but what we are seeing is the U.S. has a very clear and long list of issues that it thinks need to be addressed by China in our trade relationship. And the America First trade policy focuses almost exclusively on those issues as top of mind. Many of the advisors for the president this time around have a very unified and consistent view on China. It's often described as an existential threat to the United States in its current form and with the current policies in China. And this policy is designed to address many of those aspects. The second thing I'd say about the 20 planks in this policy are that, except for 3 of them, the rest of them can be done without legislation from Congress. The authority of the president to act in these spheres is based on existing statutes, many of them on the books for over 100 years. There's one instance in the policy that references a statute that's been on the books since 1916. So in the middle of the First World War, something that Congress passed back then, that is a tool that's in the toolbox that the president can deploy. And chief among those are the Section 232 authority, 301, and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, that is the basis for the additional 10% tariffs that went into effect on China. So there's not a need to go back to Congress or wait on Congress to pass trade legislation for the most part to implement this agenda. It can be done very quickly. Another factor here is that many of those statutes don't require a fairly extensive notice and comment rulemaking process. This is not similar to the scenario where you are with the EPA, where there has to be an extensive set of fact-finding and public comment and litigation. Most of these actions are reserved and generally deferred to by the U.S. courts as actions and authorities under the Constitution within the power of Congress and delegated by Congress to the president or within the president's inherent powers. So again, the pace, the speed, it's supported by the legislative and legal structure under which the White House is operating and the trade agencies are operating. The last thing I'll say on sort of the trade agenda, and then I'll turn to a quick rack up of where we are with tariffs, is that you do have certain pieces of that legislation that are already, or that policy that are already being implemented. And every day that ticks by, we tick another one off the list. So as of last count earlier today, we were up to 11 of the 20 planks within that policy. The president and the trade agencies have already started the process to implement. So the takeaway from that is, if your interests are impacted by these tariff actions, or you see an issue that's on the America First trade policy agenda that your company is interested in and impacted by, don't wait on the sidelines. This is the time to be looking at how it impacts your company, what you can do to try to engage. The administration is very interested in hearing from companies, and you've seen that already with the president's public statements about who he's been talking to and meeting with and the issues that are being discussed. But this is a time to be engaged with Washington. It's not only with the executive branch, but also with members of Congress and others. And so if you wait, to go back to Congressman Gordon's phrase, you might be on the menu here. In terms of the tariffs, there's a lot of moving pieces. Last night, we had the announcement that the U.S. is starting an investigation of copper imports in the United States under the Section 232 process. That's likely to lead to some tariffs on imports from some countries of copper products. And that is not only primary copper, but also derivative products. So the copper content in certain types of wire and electronic components, for example. There's going to be a fact-finding process for that. The time limit is not unlimited, and likely by April, we're going to have some recommendations to the president on that investigation. The president has also mentioned that coming up in the order for Section 232 investigations is an investigation of autos. So that is going to be looking at the U.S. trade in automotive products writ large. It's not just complete automobiles, but also the supply chain into those automobiles. It's going to be focused on some key trading partners with which the U.S. has a trade deficit in autos, starting with the European Union. And that process of fact-finding and a report is likely, and recommendations to the president, that's likely to kick off very soon, maybe in a matter of days or weeks. Other products that have been mentioned include semiconductors and lumber. And then we have the reset under the same Section 232 statute of the steel and aluminum tariffs. That is going into effect on March 12th at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time. So any imports that come in on or after that date will be subject to 25% tariffs. We've been living with those for steel already since the first Trump administration. But now there are no exclusions. There are no country-based exemptions. For aluminum, the tariff rate is going from 10% up to 25%, and the same situation is going to exist. No exemptions, no exclusions. We may see a return, depending on what the progress is made in U.S. bilateral trade discussions, of some countries potentially being exempted from those tariffs. But it's early days, and for now, our expectation is that on March 12th, we'll be living with those tariffs. Another aspect of those tariffs is they don't only apply to primary steel and aluminum, but they also apply to certain derivative products. So if you haven't yet done so, I would encourage you to take a look at the product coverage list for those two executive orders. It's quite extensive. It's something that your supply chain team should be very well aware of, because there are steps you should be taking now to, if you're impacted by them, to adjust and see what options you have. Beyond that, we have the Section 301 tariffs on China that are continuing, the 25% tariffs we've seen since 2018. And since March 4th, new tariffs on China on all products coming from China of 10%. And then the last thing I'll say on tariffs, there's a lot more to say, but I'll stop here, is we have a process kicked off for the U.S. to impose what the president has called reciprocal tariffs. The idea here is that if there is a tariff of, say, a 10% on U.S. auto exports to Europe, and the U.S. is currently only charging 2.5%, we'll look at whether we need to reset our own normal customs duty rate to account for that difference. Interestingly, the presidential order on that also accounts for non-tariff barriers to U.S. exporters to certain markets. So if there is a practice like a auto safety standard or a certification standard that is preventing U.S. industry from selling into that market, that is something that may be addressed through this reciprocal tariff mechanism. Also, certain tax programs like the VAT taxes that many countries impose, the administration is looking at whether that creates a distortion in our trade relationship and is something that should be addressed through these reciprocal tariffs. There's a report that's due to the president on April 1st on the reciprocal tariffs, and we're likely to see some sort of tariff action taken soon thereafter. Canada and Mexico are still on hold under the other 25% tariffs. That deadline for potentially renewing those is coming up on March 4th. It's always dangerous to speculate here, but my expectation currently is that there's a better chance we'll see that pause continue for some time, particularly because Mexico, especially Mexico, but Canada to a degree also seems to be making progress with the U.S. to address the issues that underlay those tariffs, which were primarily illegal drugs and immigration issues. So I'll end it there. There's more we're going to talk about on all these topics in programs coming up, but there's a lot of other things going on in Washington that you need to be aware of. So I'll turn it over to Mary, who can pick up the story from here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Mary Baker. I'm located in our Washington, D.C. office, and I lead our tax policy practice. I spent many, many years at the IRS and several years on the Hill on Senate Finance Committee before coming to K&L Gates. All of that in the tax field. And like Bart said, I've been around a while, been doing this a while. I'm currently paying very close attention to the administration policies impacting tax and also on efforts on the Hill on tax reform. And I work particularly closely with the tax committees and leadership and other stakeholders as this tax reform debate is evolving. So I think the one thing, if you take nothing else away from what I'm going to say this afternoon, is that every company, whether you are headquartered in the United States or not, has the potential to be impacted by some aspect of Trump policies. In the executive branch, as Nate has been talking about, the executive orders, also regulations, but also with Congress and the efforts at tax reform. So pay attention. This is not a time to be putting our heads in the sand. It is, there's a lot going on. It's very volatile, and there are both risks and opportunities in everything that's going on. And I would encourage you, as you are watching these things, to anticipate, well, if this happens, what's going to happen to my company? So to model the various outcomes and be prepared to react and respond, and even be proactive with your members of Congress and the agencies to let them know what the potential impacts will be. So where we are on taxes right now, if you're following at all, you know that the Senate has passed their budget resolution, and just last evening, the House squeaked by. House Republicans, with no votes to spare, passed their budget resolution, and that is the first step in this budget reconciliation process, which is what Republicans are going to be using, or at least hope to use, to pass tax reform, including extending the 2017 tax cuts. And Mike Evans is going to be following me, and he knows more about the budget reconciliation process than anybody else in Washington, D.C., and he is going to impress you with what he has to say about that. But we're going to assume that the Senate version, which is kind of two skinnier bills, the first bill, which does not include tax, the House resolution, which is kind of a fat version, which includes tax and everything else, assuming that both the Senate and the House can agree on identical budget resolutions and they go with this one bill approach. The tax committees right now, the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance, have $4.5 trillion to play with to reduce revenues, or in other words, to extend the 2017 tax cuts and to do whatever tax policy that they want to do. 4.5 trillion sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but it actually is like trying to fit a gallon into a quart container, because the tax cuts themselves, to extend the 2017 tax cuts on individuals, including the pass-through on pass-through businesses, are even more expensive than that. And then we, of course, have all the policies that President Trump talked about during his campaign, and then seems to be coming up with new ones every week. Those are very high priority on the Hill. If the president wants them, they are going to try very hard to give those to him. So that includes the no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security, repealing the carried interest loophole, maybe taking away the tax exempt status on stadium bonds. I mean, we're really getting down into some of the nits of tax policy with some of the ideas that he is coming up with. There's a huge divide, perhaps the biggest divide between the House and the Senate, other than the one bill, two bill approach, is permanency. Senate leadership and Senate Finance Committee Chairman Crapo have said that they want to make the 2017 tax cuts permanent, and the House bill does not approach it that way. So there's a big debate over which baseline do you use. Do you use the current policy baseline, or do you use current law baseline? And so there's a position in the Senate parliamentarian, who has huge impact on some of these decisions, and we do not know yet how that's all going to turn out, but that will have a big impact on how much in way of offsets and pay-fors that the tax committees need to come up with to help pay for extending the tax cuts and other policies. And then many of you will be impacted by, I'm sure, the phase out of full expensing. So that's something that Republicans want to restore back to 100% if they can. Some of you are hit by the research and experimentation, having to amortize those costs rather than fully deduct those in the first year. That again is something Republicans want to reinstate to be able to fully deduct those. Interest expense limitation, you're currently under a stricter limitation on the amount of interest expense that you can deduct. That's also something that's a high priority for Republicans. Those of you who are pass-through businesses, you do not want to lose your Section 199 Cap A deduction. So again, that's part of the tax cuts that the Republicans want to either extend or make permanent, depending on how that debate comes out. Some of you may be subject to the corporate alternative minimum tax or the stock buyback excise tax. Those, again, are things, Biden administration policies that were enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act as pay-fors that Republicans would like to undo. So that list, that you can't cram all that list into 4.5 trillion, but if you have offsets, then you could potentially reduce revenues by 7 trillion if you have 2.5 trillion of offsets. So there's going to be huge pressure on coming up with offsets. That is going to pose a risk for pretty much every business, although we do expect that Republicans will be business friendly and not try to increase tax rates. That's unlikely. But there are going to be clean energy incentives are specifically at risk. The EV tax credit looks like that is probably gone. But domestic content is another, if you're aware of the clean energy tax incentives, they're kind of based on, there's a bonus tax credit for domestic content for steel and iron and manufactured components. Particularly with the tariffs, it's going to be even more difficult to meet that domestic content bonus requirement. So that will impact cost structures and the economics of projects and deals. And then kind of following up on what Nate was talking about on retaliatory taxes, the tariffs, it's not just the tariffs that the Trump administration is looking at specifically to retaliate on other countries. It's also taxes and other practices that may be considered to be discriminatory and extraterritorial. So if any of you are caught up in the OECD Pillar 2 15% minimum tax, that could be included, value-added tax, subsidies that other countries may be offering could be included within what the Trump administration considers to be discriminatory against US companies that are competing with their foreign competitors, and even reporting regimes, country by country reporting and other types of reporting regimes that the Trump administration might consider to be discriminatory toward US companies or unfriendly to US companies. So as I said, these are not only risks, but they're also opportunities. For example, if you are negatively impacted by any of these non-US subsidies or reporting regimes or other indirect taxes, carbon border adjustment mechanism, those could be issues that you could flag for the administration and say you need to consider these when you're considering what's retaliatory. And the US Trade Representative has actually solicited public comments on those. So you have, I think, until March 11 to submit comments. We're working on some of those. So if that's something you're interested in, let us know. And just the last thing that I would flag is that we have a continuing resolution. The government funding is going to be expiring on March 14. And so the Congress is going to have to work together, Democrats and Republicans, to come up with a way to fund the government, or we could be facing a shutdown. So that's going to interrupt some of what's going on with tax reform because they're going to have to deal with that. And with that, I will turn it over to our colleague, Mike Evans.
Good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to dig down a little bit deeper, picking up from where Mary left off, and talk about the procedure that's going on. And just by way of background, I returned to the firm a little over 2 years ago. And before that, I spent 27 years in the Senate, including more than a decade as chief counsel to the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over taxes and trade and a lot of the spending programs. And a large part of my job was to oversee the procedures, including this reconciliation procedure that everybody's talking about. So I'm going to dig a little bit more into that, into the budget process. The budget process, debate that's going on really has three elements. One is the appropriations process. As Mary mentioned, the appropriations bills, the continuing resolutions expire March 14th. So we're going to have to figure out what to do about the appropriations for the year. Second is the debt limit. The X date, that is the date when the government hits the debt limit, really hits the debt limit, is sometime in the summer, and there'll have to be a continuation of an extension of the debt limit by then. So you have the appropriations process, then you have the debt limit, and then you have the reconciliation process, which is what I'm going to focus on. And that is the process by which Republicans, having the trifecta, a majority in the House, Senate, and holding the White House, can pass major budget-related legislation without being subject to a Democratic filibuster in the Senate, the reconciliation process. Now, the reconciliation process really has two steps. The first is the adoption of a budget resolution. This is the framework. It sets targets, overall targets, and gives instructions to congressional committees to go off and put together details to meet those targets. And by doing that, it unlocks this reconciliation process that allows you to pass something without being subject to a filibuster in the Senate. So the first step is to pass a budget resolution, setting a framework and unlocking the process. The second step is to come back and actually pass that reconciliation legislation itself. That is the legislation that fills in the details. We're now in the first step, the framework, the budget resolution. This requires the passage of a single identical budget resolution through both the House and the Senate. Both the House and the Senate have moved forward with their versions. Last week, the Senate passed its version, and last night, as Mary said, by a whisker, the House passed its version. So you have the Senate bill last week, the Senate resolution, and the House resolution last night. Now they have to come up with a single version. There has to be a meeting of the minds in order to pass a single identical version of the resolution and consequently unlock the reconciliation process. The big debate, as you probably heard, is whether to do a single reconciliation bill or two reconciliation bills. And the Senate view is that you should go through this twice. Let's shoot a layup first. The easy things, relatively easy things, defense spending, energy, and controlling the border. And then having done that, we can come back and take the 3-point shot, which is taxes and spending cuts. So let's go through this twice. The House approach is instead a single bill. The president calls it one big, beautiful bill. Let's put everything in a single bill. So the Senate resolution that passed last week took the Senate position. Let's do two bills. The House version that passed last night is the one big, beautiful bill. And that's where we are. Now they have to come to an agreement. To my mind, the smart move for the Republicans is for the House basically to persuade the Senate to take up and pass the bill that the House passed last night. That is, the House sent its version back to the Senate and persuade the senators to set their earlier version aside and pass the House bill. Now, that's easier said than done. The bill passed by a whisker of one vote in the House, because they only have 1-vote margin, 2-vote margin. In the Senate, it's 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. So there's a little bit of space there. I think the debate over the next few days will be whether Republican senators are willing to take up and pass the House bill. They can lose a few votes. Senator Murkowski perhaps, or Senator Collins, and as long as they have 50 plus the vice president, they can pass it. So we'll see over the next few days, over the next week or two, whether they can come to an agreement. Most likely, the effort will be to get the Senate to take up and pass the House version, but we'll see. Now, once they come to an agreement, if they do, then comes the hard part. That is filling in the details by passing real legislation, reconciliation legislation that fills in the details. And that's when you get to the difficult decisions, particularly how to deal with various tax issues. And as Mary said, how do you fit 10 pounds of sand into a 1 pound bag? And also spending cuts. When the House took up its bill yesterday, there was a big debate about whether they were cutting Medicaid or not. That's an $800 billion question. And they kind of finessed it last night by saying, well, maybe it's Medicaid, maybe it's something else. But when you do this reconciliation bill, you have to get into the details and make these decisions. So this debate, assuming that there can be a meeting of the minds over the next week or so, 2 weeks, then we'll get to reconciliation. That reconciliation bill filling in the details will be fast paced. It will have huge stakes. As Mary said, lots of tax issues on the table, other issues on the table, and it will overlap to some extent with the other budget issues that we mentioned, the appropriations process and the debt limit. But we're likely to see, assuming that they can reach an agreement, a huge tax reconciliation bill that gets into a lot of very important details soon. It'll be a wild game with high stakes, and we'll be paying close attention. Thanks for your attention. I'll stop there.
There's been a lot of information thrown at people here. And so let me maybe summarize it in this sense. The next few weeks could be some of the most consequential to your company ever. And as I've heard Nate say, everything is negotiable with this administration. So it's important for you to be following, understand how the taxes, tariffs, executive orders could impact your company, your employees, and then react to that. Put together how, not just hypothetically, but how this is really going to affect you and your employees. And that's how I think you're going to have to engage with this administration, both for the positive things and the negative things that could and probably will happen to you. Thank you.
I think that's a great comment to kind of close out the order here. I would just add, we've thrown a lot at you, as the congressman just said, and we will be unpacking many of the other threads that we've touched upon in this webinar, in coming webinars. But in the interim, you have great resources with your association. So the team at ABMA and AGMA, they're tracking a lot of these issues closely. I know they're regularly posting information that's relevant to these issues on the websites. If you haven't taken a look at those resources, I encourage you to do so. And this is really, we can't say it enough, a crucial time. So being prepared, understanding where these issues are and how they impact your company, and understanding what resources you have available to you. So we do look forward to, as you have questions, if there are issues that you want to talk further upon, of course, any of the speakers in this panel would be glad to pick that up. There are going to be programs coming up, just a preview for you, that touch upon things including what's happening with immigration. We had a major announcement on that yesterday, and the president's followed up with that. What's happening with various parts of the transportation sector, and in many, many other areas of trade, tariffs, taxes, where the U.S. is going in its bilateral relationship with some key countries and markets, I know for many of you. So watch this space, watch the association websites, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you, everybody.